In the summer of 1973, a state trooper responding to a routine trespassing call in the forests of northern Pennsylvania stumbled upon something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the dense morning fog, he found them 7 children, ages 4 to 14, standing in a perfect circle around a dead oak tree. Their clothes were rotted, their hair was matted with soil and pine needles, and covering every inch of their exposed skin were symbols. Not tattoos, not paint. Something carved into their flesh years before, healed over into raised white scars that formed patterns no one in that county had ever seen. When the trooper asked them their names, all 7 children answered in unison with the same 2 words: "We're Haverly." Then they went silent. They wouldn't speak again for 6 months. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What happened to the Haverly children between 1968 and 1973 remains one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American social history. But what happened after they were found, the systematic unraveling of their story, the revelation of what those symbols meant, and the discovery of how deep the Haverly Clan's secrets actually went, that's the part that was buried. Not by accident, by design. Because what those children carried on their skin wasn't just trauma. It was a map, a genealogy, a record of something that powerful people wanted erased from history. This is not a story about a cult. This is not a story about abuse, though abuse was everywhere. This is a story about bloodlines, inheritance, and what happens when a family decides that some knowledge is worth sacrificing their own children to preserve. My name is not important. What matters is what I'm about to show you. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. Everything you're about to hear is documented. Everything happened. The only question is whether you're ready to know why. The trooper's name was Daniel Pritchard, and in the report he filed that morning, a report that would be sealed by the county for 32 years, he wrote that the children didn't run when they saw him. They didn't cry. They didn't even blink. They just stared at him with what he described as eyes that had already seen the worst thing possible. When he radioed for backup and child protective services, he made a decision that probably saved those children's lives. He didn't approach them. He didn't try to grab them or corral them into his vehicle. He just sat down on the forest floor, 20 feet away, and waited. And after nearly an hour of silence, the oldest girl, her name was later determined to be Esther, walked over to him, knelt down, and whispered a single sentence into his ear. "They told us you'd come eventually." By the time social workers and county officials arrived at the scene, the children had been coaxed into sitting inside Pritchard's patrol car. They were emaciated, dehydrated, covered in insect bites and shallow lacerations. But the scars those symbols carved into their arms, their backs, their legs, those were old, healed. Some of them had clearly been there for years. A pediatrician who examined them that afternoon estimated that the youngest child, a boy named Silas, had received his first markings when he was no older than 2. The cuts had been deliberate, precise, made with something sharp enough to control depth and angle. This wasn't violence. This was ritual. And when the medical examiner tried to photograph the symbols for evidence, something strange happened. The children became hysterical, not scared, protective. They covered their skin with their hands and screamed in a language that nobody recognized. It took 3 hours to calm them down. And when they finally did, Esther looked at the examiner and said in perfect English, "If you take pictures, they'll know where we are." The question everyone asked was obvious. Who were they? The children wouldn't say. For 6 months, they lived in a state group home outside of Scranton, under the supervision of a rotating team of social workers and trauma counselors. They barely spoke. They refused to be separated. They ate only certain foods and only at certain times. They wouldn't sleep in beds. They slept on the floor, arranged in the same circular formation they'd been found in. And every night, just after midnight, they would wake up simultaneously and begin whispering to each other in that same unrecognizable language. Linguists brought in to analyze the recordings couldn't place it. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't any indigenous dialect from the region. It was something else, something constructed. And the more researchers listened, the more they began to suspect that it wasn't just a language, it was a code. The breakthrough came in March of 1974, when a graduate student from Penn State named Caroline Vess was brought in to work with the children as part of her thesis on childhood trauma and memory retention. Vess wasn't a psychologist, she was an anthropologist, and unlike everyone else who had tried to communicate with the Haverly children, she didn't ask them questions. She just observed. She sat with them. She drew pictures. She hummed. And after 3 weeks of silence, Esther approached her with a piece of paper. On it, Esther had drawn one of the symbols from her own arm, a circular pattern with 3 intersecting lines and a series of dots arranged around the perimeter. Beneath it, in careful handwriting, she had written a single word: grandfather. Vess understood immediately. The symbols weren't random, they were genealogical. Each marking represented a family member, a lineage, a position within the clan structure. She asked Esther to draw more, and over the next 2 months, Esther filled notebook after notebook with drawings, names, and dates. The other children watched. They didn't stop her. In fact, they helped. Together, they reconstructed a family tree that went back 7 generations, and what that tree revealed was staggering. The Haverly clan wasn't just a family, it was a network, a shadow lineage that stretched across 4 states: Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and New York. There were over 200 people connected to the clan, most of them living under different surnames, in different towns, with no apparent connection to one another, except for the children. The children all bore the marks. Vess took her findings to the state authorities, and that's when everything changed. Within a week, her research was confiscated. She was removed from the case. The children were transferred to an undisclosed location, and the group home was shut down. No explanation was given. No records were made public. Caroline Vess tried to fight it. She filed complaints. She contacted journalists. She even tried to go directly to the families listed in Esther's drawings. But every door she knocked on was either abandoned or occupied by people who claimed they'd never heard the name Haverly. And then, in August of 1974, Caroline Vess disappeared. Her car was found in a grocery store parking lot outside of Harrisburg. Her purse was still inside. Her keys were in the ignition. She was never seen again. The official investigation concluded that she had likely run away to avoid academic pressure. But the people who knew her said that was impossible. Caroline Vess wasn't running from anything. She was running toward the truth, and someone made sure she never reached it. For nearly a decade, the Haverly case went cold. The children were placed in separate foster homes under sealed identities. The notebooks Esther had filled were locked away in a state archive that required judicial clearance to access, and the story, for all intents and purposes, disappeared. But in 1983, something happened that forced it back into the light. A historian researching land deeds in Appalachian, Pennsylvania, came across a name in an 1867 property record: Josiah Haverly. And next to his name, in the clerk's handwriting, was a note that read, Clan Elder. Markings confirmed. The historian's name was Dr. Raymond Polk, and he wasn't looking for the Haverly clan when he found them. He was researching something entirely different: post-Civil War land redistribution and the displacement of rural families during the industrial boom. But that single notation in an 1867 land deed stopped him cold. Markings confirmed. What did that mean? Why would a county clerk in 1867 need to confirm markings on someone's body in order to process a property transfer? Polk spent the next 2 years digging through courthouse basements, church records, and genealogical archives across Pennsylvania, and what he found was a pattern, a deliberate, carefully maintained system that stretched back to the 1700s. The Haverly clan, as far as Polk could determine, originated in the mountains of southwestern Pennsylvania sometime around 1730. They were not Native American, though they lived in close proximity to indigenous communities and appeared to have adopted certain practices. They were not immigrants in the traditional sense. There were no ship manifests, no Ellis Island records, no documentation of their arrival. They simply appeared in land records, tax rolls, and census data as if they had always been there. And from the very beginning, there were references to the marks. In 1749, a traveling preacher wrote in his journal about encountering a strange family in the hills, whose children bore upon their flesh the history of their fathers, carved in symbols no Christian ought to recognize. In 1792, a frontier doctor recorded treating a young girl with deliberate scarification across her shoulders and back, arranged in patterns she claimed were her inheritance. The Haverleys were known. They were documented. But they were never interfered with. Polk's research revealed something even more unsettling. The Haverly Clan wasn't just isolated, they were protected. In 1812, when federal surveyors attempted to map the region for potential railroad expansion, they were turned away by local militias who claimed the land was spoken for. In 1846, when a county sheriff tried to investigate reports of children living in the forest without schooling, he was blocked by a circuit judge who ruled that the family had ancestral rights predating statehood. And in 1891, when a Presbyterian missionary tried to establish a church near Haverly territory, the building burned down 3 nights before its dedication. No arrests were made. No investigation was opened. The message was clear. The Haverleys were not to be disturbed. But why? What made this particular family so significant that local governments, law enforcement, and even religious institutions went out of their way to leave them alone? Polk believed he found the answer in a set of letters written by a frontier land agent named Thaddeus Crow in 1803. Crow had been tasked with cataloging families living in the Western Territories for tax purposes, and in one letter to his superior, he described encountering the Haverleys. He wrote, "They do not farm as others do. They do not trade. They do not attend church. But they keep the old records, the ones the Crown wanted burned. And every man in these hills knows that if the Haverleys fall, the land will forget itself." Polk didn't understand what that meant. Not at first. But as he cross-referenced Crow's letters with colonial-era property disputes, indigenous land treaties, and early American legal documents, a theory began to form. The Haverleys weren't just a family, they were record keepers, living archives, and the symbols carved into their children's skin weren't just genealogy, they were land claims, contracts, proof of ownership that predated the United States itself. When Dr. Polk finally published his findings in 1985, he did so in an obscure academic journal that most historians had never heard of. The article was titled, "Corporeal Cartography, Evidence of Pre-Colonial Land Documentation in Appalachian Scarification Practices." It was dense, it was technical, and it was terrifying, because what Polk had discovered was that the Haverly children weren't just carrying family history on their skin, they were carrying legal documents, maps, territorial boundaries, resource rights. The symbols weren't arbitrary. They were a language of ownership, passed down through generations, that detailed who controlled what land, which water sources belonged to which bloodline, and who had the right to extract minerals, timber, and game from specific regions. And according to Polk's research, these claims were older than the Declaration of Independence, older than the colonies. Some of them might have predated European contact entirely. Here's where it gets complicated. In the 1700s, as European settlers pushed deeper into Appalachia, they encountered a problem. The land they were claiming had already been claimed not by indigenous nations, though that was also true, but by families who had been living there for so long that no one could remember when they'd arrived. These families didn't have paper deeds. They didn't have royal charters or government grants. What they had were oral traditions, physical markers, and in some cases, markings on their bodies that served as living proof of ancestral rights. The colonial governments couldn't recognize these claims officially. It would have undermined the entire legal framework of westward expansion. But they couldn't ignore them either, because these families controlled access to critical resources. So a compromise was made, unofficial, unspoken. The families would be left alone, allowed to govern their own territories, as long as they stayed quiet and didn't challenge the expansion of American law. The Haverly Clan was one of these families. Maybe the last one. And the symbols carved into their children weren't just tradition, they were insurance. Every child born into the clan received markings that encoded their position in the family structure, their inheritance rights, and their connection to specific parcels of land. If a Haverly could show their scars to the right people, people who understood the old systems, they could lay claim to territory that no court would recognize, but that everyone in the region would respect. It was a parallel legal system, a shadow government that operated beneath the surface of official America. And it worked. For centuries, it worked. Until the children were found in 1973. Because the moment those children were removed from clan custody, the moment their markings were photographed and documented and studied by outsiders, the entire system was exposed. And the people who had spent generations protecting that system realized they had a problem. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have protected the secret? Or would you have let the truth come out? Dr. Polk's article was published in June of 1985. By September, every copy of the journal had been purchased by an anonymous buyer and removed from library circulation. Polk himself received multiple offers to cease his research. One from a private law firm, one from a historical preservation society, and one from an entity that identified itself only as interested parties. He refused them all. In December of 1985, Raymond Polk died of an apparent heart attack in his office at the university. He was 41 years old. He had no history of heart disease. The autopsy was performed by a county medical examiner who had been appointed to his position 3 weeks earlier. The findings were never challenged. And just like Caroline Vess before him, Polk's research vanished. His files were cleaned out. His notes were never recovered. And the one person who might have been able to continue his work, his graduate assistant, refused to speak about the case ever again. She would only say, years later, in an anonymous interview, "Some doors are closed for a reason, and the people on the other side are still watching." It wasn't until 2007, 34 years after they were found, that one of the Haverly children finally spoke publicly. Her name had been changed. Her identity had been legally sealed. But in a recorded interview given to an independent documentarian under conditions of strict anonymity, the woman who had once been called Esther told her story. And what she revealed was worse than anyone had imagined. She said the children hadn't been kidnapped. They hadn't been abandoned. They had been sent into the forest, deliberately, hidden, because the clan knew that something was coming. A reckoning, a legal challenge to the land, claims that had been ignored for generations. And the adults believed that if the children could disappear, if they could survive in the wilderness long enough for the danger to pass, then the knowledge carved into their skin would be preserved. The children were never supposed to be found. They were supposed to wait. Esther described life within the clan as something both ordinary and unimaginable. The children attended school. They played. They celebrated birthdays. But from the age of 2 or 3, they also underwent the marking ceremonies. She said the cuts were made with a tool that had been in the family for generations, a blade made of bone, not metal, that left specific types of scars. The ceremonies happened in complete darkness, in a stone structure deep in the forest that the clan called the registry. Each child would be brought there alone, and an elder, usually a grandparent or great-aunt, would carve the new symbols while reciting the family history aloud. The pain was extreme. The children were not given anything to dull it. Esther said that was part of the process. The pain made you remember. It made the knowledge permanent, not just on your skin, but in your mind. You learned to read the symbols by feeling them, by tracing them with your fingers in the dark, and by the time you were 10 years old, you could recite the entire genealogy of the clan, the boundaries of every land parcel, and the location of every resource site, all from memory. But Esther also said something that changed the entire context of the case. She said the markings weren't just about land. They were about survival. The Haverly clan believed, rightly or not, that they were the last holders of a specific type of knowledge about the land itself, where the water would be clean in a drought, where the soil would grow food when everything else failed, which forests would shelter you in a freeze, which mountains held minerals that could be traded when currency collapsed. This wasn't superstition. This was information gathered over centuries, tested and confirmed by generations of people who had lived through wars, famines, economic collapses, and plagues. The clan didn't see themselves as criminals or cultists. They saw themselves as stewards. And the children weren't victims. They were chosen, selected to carry the archive forward into the next generation. Esther said she didn't feel abused. She felt honored. And even decades later, even after everything that had happened, she still believed that what her family had done was necessary. The problem, Esther explained, was that the clan had enemies. Not just the government, though the government was certainly interested in breaking their hold on the land, but also other families, other lineages who had once held similar claims but had lost them through assimilation, intermarriage, or legal defeat. These families resented the Haverleys. They wanted the knowledge the Haverleys possessed, and in the late 1960s, one of those families made a move. They hired lawyers. They dug up old property records. They found inconsistencies in the colonial-era surveys that the Haverleys had relied on for centuries, and they threatened to take everything to court. A court case would mean exposure. It would mean testimony. It would mean showing the markings to judges, to juries, to the public. The clan elders knew they couldn't allow that, so they made the decision to hide the children, to erase them from the system, to let the legal challenge proceed without the living evidence. And it almost worked. The case was dismissed in 1972 for lack of proof, but by then, the children had been in the forest for 4 years, and one of the elders, racked with guilt, had left an anonymous tip with the state police. That's how Officer Pritchard found them, not by accident, by design. Someone in the clan had broken the pact. The interview with Esther was never officially released. The documentarian who recorded it tried to shop it to networks, streaming platforms, and true crime outlets. Every single one declined. Not because the story wasn't compelling, but because, according to multiple sources, legal threats were issued the moment the footage began circulating in industry circles. Threats that cited privacy violations, defamation, and something called breach of protected heritage status, a legal designation that most entertainment attorneys had never even heard of. The footage was shelved. The documentarian moved on to other projects, and Esther disappeared back into anonymity. But before the interview was buried, a few details leaked, and those details painted a picture of what happened to the Haverly children after they were separated and placed in foster care. 3 of them died before reaching adulthood, 1 from a car accident, 1 from pneumonia, 1 from what was ruled a suicide but that Esther insisted was something else. The remaining 4, including Esther, survived, but they never stopped carrying the marks, and they never stopped being watched. Esther claimed that throughout her life in every city she moved to, every job she took, every relationship she formed, there were always people nearby who knew, not everyone, but enough. She'd notice someone staring at her scars in a grocery store. A stranger at a gas station would ask her if she'd ever been to Pennsylvania. A landlord would give her a lease without asking for references. She said it felt like being part of a network she couldn't see, but that could always see her. And in 2004, something happened that confirmed her suspicions. She received a letter, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of the stone structure she had described. The registry. It was still standing, and written on the back of the photograph, in handwriting she recognized as belonging to one of the elders who had marked her as a child, were 5 words. "The land still remembers you. What does that mean?" Esther didn't know, or if she did, she wouldn't say. But in the years since that interview was recorded, researchers, historians, and journalists who have tried to follow up on the Haverly case have encountered the same pattern. Doors that close, records that vanish, sources who refuse to talk, and in some cases, consequences. In 2009, a freelance journalist named Michael Stern published a blog post connecting the Haverly case to a series of suspicious property transfers in western Pennsylvania. Within a month, his blog was taken down for violating terms of service. His email account was hacked, and he received a visit from 2 men who claimed to be from a historical preservation nonprofit. They told him that his research was interfering with ongoing cultural heritage work, and that if he continued, he could be held liable for damages. Stern stopped writing about the Haverleys. When asked why, years later, he would only say, "Because I have a family, and I want them to stay safe." So where does that leave us? The Haverly children are still alive, as far as anyone knows. They're in their 50s and 60s now. They live under different names, in different states, leading what appear to be normal lives. But the markings are still there, and according to Esther, the knowledge is still there too. Passed down, protected, waiting. Waiting for what? She wouldn't say. But she did say this. People think the past is dead. They think that because something happened a long time ago, it doesn't matter anymore. But the land doesn't forget. And blood doesn't forget. And when the systems people trust start to fall apart, when the maps stop making sense, and the laws stop protecting them, they'll come looking for the people who still know how to survive. And we'll be here. We've always been here. Whether you believe that or not is up to you. Whether you think the Haverly Clan was protecting something valuable or perpetuating something dangerous is your decision to make. But the fact remains. 7 children were found in a forest in 1973 with a history carved into their skin. And every person who tried to tell their story either disappeared, died, or was silenced. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's documented fact. And the question you have to ask yourself is simple. If this story didn't matter, why would anyone go to such lengths to bury it? The markings are still out there. The children are still out there. And somewhere in the mountains of Pennsylvania, that stone structure, the registry, is still standing, waiting for the next generation, waiting for the moment when the old knowledge becomes necessary again. And maybe, just maybe, that moment is closer than any of us want to believe. If you made it this far, you've seen something most people never will. The truth beneath the surface. The history that powerful people tried to erase. Share this video if you think others deserve to know. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And remember, some stories don't end. They just wait for the right time to be told again. Thank you for watching. And be careful what you go looking for. Because sometimes, the past looks back. Retry.